Hello and welcome to the Freedom Anarchist News Review. With me tonight I have Sam and I have Andy. Hello to you both.
Right.
Hello.
And we have a short but potentially
Hmm.
slightly more in-depth one for this week, given that this month is silly season and there's only been one news story, and that has essentially been the far right throwing an enormous tantrum or an enormous series of tantrums, first with protests against various hotels, and more recently with scrawling red crosses all over shop fronts, which I'm sure um, we have no problem with at all because we love that kind of thing. Graffiti, great. Um, we will follow that up with a bit of chat about Reform, who have timed their inevitable deport everyone announcement for the same period, getting blanket coverage, and Labour, who, because they've spent the last year in lockstep with Reform, seem completely unable to push back on any element of what it is that they've been saying. Um, We will follow this up with a couple of smaller stories, one being the UK hitting its lowest birth rate ever. This may have some relevance to what we were talking about beforehand. And finally, a slightly odd one, but not, again, not entirely unpredictable. ACAS is planning to bring in AI to try and settle industrial disputes, which a very entertaining little aside by the FT writing about it was that the FT was very shocked that over the last few years, labour groups, unions, individuals have become less and less likely to go to ACAS before they go to industrial action. Can't imagine why. So, with that out of the way, I will turn over to, as Sam, it's the first time Sam's been here for a little while. Sam, what is your view on the Epping protests and the whole fallout situation from that?
Wow. It's I mean, obviously it's a problem. No one likes to see crowds of racists throwing their weight around. And this is obviously something that should be opposed by anyone who is concerned about such things. And even those who aren't concerned about it should probably also consider opposing it. Um, the it's kind of interesting though, because there is a certain kind of question as to sort of whether or not we're kind of seeing it, kind of go as far as it kind of can go in a way. It's not obviously building a huge amount of momentum. It seems to be the same faces kind of going out, and a lot of the people who are, sort of have been sort of attending are known faces, and with far right sort of, clearly being behind it, the sort of typical sort of story of this is just concerned locals is sort of just doesn't really seem to be kind of capturing anyone. Like there are obviously always those who will sort of just sort of take that for granted, but by and large, most people don't seem to be kind of do seem to be seeing through that particular uh point. Um yeah, I mean, what's more to
I
sort of
mean,
say really fair.
so the thing that's worrying me. So actually, this is a specific thing that happened this morning. Um, on This Morning, there you go, TV show This Morning, who viewers may or may not be aware, presenter Rylan Clark has been on there. We sort of mentioned this on Blue Sky uh, earlier today. Uh, but Ryan Clark, generally speaking, not considered political in any real sense, I think it's fair to say, has actually said complimentary things about migrants before now, and indeed did whilst talking on this morning, but also was relaying the idea that there is, in his words, a narrative of open borders, essentially, um, and rewards for people who arrive on boats, and he was essentially repeating the same line that we see from GB News, Nigel Farage, talking about four-star hotels, lots of benefits, rolling out the red carpet, yada, yada, yada. All of which are, if you pay any attention at all, you can knock these down in 30 seconds, right? Like the idea that the British government of all entities is generously handing out four-star hotel concierge treatment to migrants, as opposed to putting them in whatever facilities happen to meet the bedrock rules they have to follow, so that they can keep an eye on them. Obviously ludicrous, but Ryland Clark is an interesting one, I think, because he doesn't strike me as strongly political, and his tendency will be to not try and, he's a This Morning host. He's not supposed to cause big stirs with his politics. These things that happen once in a blue moon, right? Um, but the fact that he felt he needed to say something along those lines is a bit canary in the coal mine, a bit of a bell end weather situation. Um, he's I think the thing that worries me is that what we have is only one narrative happening at the moment. So you have the protests in at Epping Hotel happening. Then you have the media basically chasing around, going, "Oh well, they really do. They have a point." Lots of vox pops of Robert Jenrick behaving like, talking in the same tones as the National Front from the 1990s, with outright like homeland leaders behind him, all being interviewed themselves uncritically. Um, and nothing else happening in the media. There's very few people standing up in the media and saying these people are talking nonsense. This is a moral panic, and this is followed by Farage, sort of as part of this, doing this uh, new policy set, which involves making deals with the bloody Taliban to send people back, throwing out the ECHR, and where Labour is on all this, far from going on telly to say these people are talking madness. None of this makes any sense, and none of these policies have any legs. You've got nothing from Yvette Cooper, just absolutely absent. And you have like a Labour MP, Graham Stringer, coming out and saying, "Oh, I think we should withdraw from the ECHR." Yeah, absolutely incredible thing for a Labour MP to say. I would kind of half expect it from a right-wing Tory, or certainly from Reform. But that's one of those kind of totemic ones which Labour has always used to differentiate itself from the Tories, right? Like none of us would go down that route. We still believe in human rights. Um, I think that's the thing which I've been finding worrying about this. It's not, like watching bald drunk uncles scrawling red crosses on roundabouts is silly. And these people they make fools of themselves, and they're very easy to laugh at. The problem, I think, is that their activities are not like, they are symptomatic of a general trend in which things which would have not that long ago been considered extreme are now being treated with serious nodding of heads, and BBC pundits saying, "Well, we need to talk about this. This is reasonable questions."
Yeah, so I think I think that that last bit, in particular, you've really kind of got to the kind of core of it. If I came across as being a bit dismissive of it all, sort of earlier, that was more just a sort of sense of frustration with it
Sure.
all more than anything else. But no, I think the reason, like, sort of, I think, I met, sort of, I was sort of, sort of being like that was because it ultimately that is a sort of more of a sort of symptom of things. And what you were saying about how the kind of conversation sort of has very obviously shifted, that should be more concerning, and should be what we're more worried about. I think that is definitely a very good point. It's not because it's not just sort of people on the BBC. It's pretty much sort of everyone. It's the thing where kind of the whole kind of reasonable questions sort of are being asked, and we need to answer them on immigration. That used to be just sort of dismissed. You just sort of be like, oh, sort of typical, a typical point being made by sort of a far right politician or whatever. And now the kind of conversation is you have sort of centrists and left of centres supposedly people who are coming out with sentences like, you know, Labour needs to do something about this. Why, they're sort of, it's all very well saying this, but why aren't they sort of actually sort of stepping up and actually deporting people? And this is coming from people who, would generally be considered to be kind of quite reasonable. And, the fact that people are now sort of, kind of, sort of people on the centre or left of sort of centre who would normally sort of, in the past would have considered such sort of things kind of quite vulgar or, sort of even, sort of the domain of the far right, are now sort of directly advocating, um, you know, uh, deportations as, the fact that Labour aren't deporting people is a policy failure, and they are themselves calling for it and sort of treating, the idea of mass deportation as, a legitimate thing that, can be achieved and in fact is so desirable because, the fact that people are concerned about it means that it should be done. And it's absolutely nuts to sort of hear sort of people who you would consider to be, maybe non-political, but definitely, very milquetoast coming out with stuff that, would have been criticised, across the front pages if like, a sort of Tory had sort of said it, you know, and that's the thing which is really quite scary, I think, at the moment. And yeah, it's I think that's much more concerning than a couple of people, the amount of people who are going out and sort of tying flag posts, sorry, flags to lamp posts and painting roundabouts. That can't be more than a couple of, maybe 100, maybe more, if that, across the country. It's it really can't be that many people. But the fact that regular people are becoming more accepting of the idea that mass deportation is a legitimate thing to consider is frankly terrifying.
Yeah, and also the
Yeah,
way in which, sorry, Andy.
yeah. I mean, obviously, like most of us, we're worried about the followers of some apparent soldier whose record, certainly on animal rights, doesn't seem to be very good. The backer of some Middle Eastern cult coming here and imposing his religion on our country. So this St. George character seems to be a really bad egg, as far as I can tell. Um, the I think at the heart of this there is government incompetence. One of the strongest arguments against, in favour of immigration, is the country needs it, as you will see from item further down the agenda. But the government is deliberately blocking asylum seekers from working, which would be the benefit to the nation, and is seen to be paying out an extortionate amount of money because they haven't sorted out a proper accommodation system for people claiming asylum. So, if the decisions on asylum were being made in a matter of weeks, and then those who had a legitimate claim to asylum were given the opportunity to find a job and helped in the community, then we will be a far better position to argue against it. But there is this economic argument that the right is turning around saying that they're a burden on the country because we won't let them work, and the government is incompetent, which it is, and it's costing the taxpayers money. There's other more racist stuff in there, but they've got a hook into common sense arguments on the incompetence of a raft of different governments, and that's going to be problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I mean, the hotels thing in particular is obviously there is an element of it which is not the government's fault, which is that if you have lots of people come in and you are essentially required to keep them, uh, if not detained, then certainly within a known space so that you can keep an eye on them, right? Like this is something that the body politic is demanding of the government. You can't just sling them into council housing. You can't just like say to them, "Cool, find somewhere and do your own thing." You've got to put them somewhere where you are registering them, saying where they are, etc., etc. That's something that the government is asked to do, right? So if you're doing that, your only options are A, I mean, you have to find somewhere to put them in which that is possible. And obviously, the government starts out, and the Tory government started out by putting them into um, places like old army bases, old RAF bases, where they had barracks of sorts, and doing a kind of cheap and cheerful um, sort of refurb of the barracks and putting them in there. The problem was that the refurbs and the barracks were not suitable because it put and to bear in mind the bottom, the floor of treatment for asylum seekers is not high. It's not like you're having to give them a particular thread count of Egyptian cotton on their beds or anything. You're just it's three hots and a cot. That's pretty much the whole deal, right? Um, but they're still not capable of renovating those properly, and you can make a good case that that is a form of incompetence. But if you don't have enough spaces that are of a quality that is high enough, you have to put them somewhere, and therefore hotels come into it. And those hotels, in some cases, are formally, they are not currently, but formally rather more grandiose than one star. And so all of that makes sense. Um, but you then, as you say, Andy, you then make it impossible for them to pay their own way, and you just stick them there at escalating expense, and then you find yourself unable to make an argument that they are anything other than a burden. But you also can't kick them out, and this is the fundamental problem, or it's not a problem for the likes of Reform or Homeland or Patriotic Alternative or whatever, right? Like it's not a problem for them because they get to say, we don't want migrants here in these hotels. And the government can't kick them out because the other option is to put them out on the streets. And you can only imagine the fury if you're throwing a bunch of people to rough sleep on the streets of London or Manchester or wherever, right? Like that's the thing which it would be great for Reform or Homeland because then they could say, look, all of these criminals out on the streets causing trouble.
I I do kind of question to a certain extent the level to which this is kind of sort of incompetence. That is a lot of that is a kind of definitely a sort of view that sort of a lot of people sort of, but there does seem to me to ring a certain still like the continuation of Theresa May's hostile environment. Now, I'm not saying that it's not incompetent, that the government is not incompetent, because obviously it is and will always be and will continue to be so. But at the same time, I do wonder, like, whether, sort of this, if you kind of go back and look at, the hostile environment that, stuff, sort of how much of that was sort of set up to allow for that incompetence to be, and allow for all that to be contribute to the so-called hostile environment, and how much of that has basically either been ignored or allowed to kind of continue. So whether or not it's this government's incompetence or even this government's design, or whether it's the previous government's design and it's kind of continuing to sort of fulfill that that, because this particular point that kind of I am reminded of was when the Labour were asking the Tories about the backlog of immigration, not just for sort of illegal immigration, or not illegal immigration, but sort of immigration and asylum seekers, refugees, all sorts of immigration. Legitimate was the word I was looking for. Legitimate, their words. Immigration. How come the backlog for people such as people coming from Australia, for example, I think was the one given. How come that there's such a backlog of that, sort of desirable immigrants? Read that how you will. how come there's such a backlog of that? And basically, the kind of half answer given by the minister of you know whatever it was at the time basically said that by making the process of gaining access to the country as thoroughly unpleasant for literally everyone, that contributes to the hostile environment that sort of even if even sort of supposedly desirable people kind of have a hard time getting here. It makes everything sort of hellish, and that's part of it by design. So obviously if you've put in all that bureaucracy and then you do nothing to get rid of it, it's basically just kind of continuing that idea. And as far as I can see, Labour has done absolutely nothing and is showing no desire to do anything to change this pointless, well, deliberately and pointless bureaucracy, which I so like I do kind of wonder to what extent this is sort of like truly true incompetence, or whether it is like part of the design of the infrastructure, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. Little column A, little column B is often the answer there. But yeah, I mean, I think certainly the deliberate construction of a system which is uh, difficult to navigate. These things come about naturally within government, right? Because government is constantly um, reworking things, both with every new administration and with every new person who comes in to a particular role, particularly management. They'll tend to be rewriting things according to their views or responding to sometimes quite transitory um, changes in necessity. Like the current rules which are being put together for a surge in migration. Like surges in migration, I mean, they're likely to continue and worsen, as we know, primarily thanks to things like the increase in the number of wars that are going on, climate change, which will build into that fairly significantly over the next however long. Um, but the actual measures that are being taken now, those kind of emergency measures, they're a layer of rules which they may help cope with the current moment, and then later on they will become unfit for purpose. But aspects of them will live on in this kind of Gorman-ghastly agglomeration of bits and pieces all mashed together, um, which ends up with legislation which is fundamentally slow and unfit for the job that it tries to do. Um, And then, of course, you pile it all in with international law as well, which will quite often itself be difficult to navigate um, and conflictual with the laws of the land here. Uh, so you have all of these kind of, I mean, obviously anarchism tends to have a criticism of this from a structural perspective anyway, right? We tend to look upon uh, authoritarian regimes and governmental regimes of any kind and say, well, yeah, of course, these inflexibilities will tend to pile up one on top of the other. Um, but they are then also taken advantage of by political entities like Reform and indeed the Conservatives right now, right? Like there's a wing of the Conservatives that are taking advantage of, I mean, Jenrick being the most obvious candidate, taking advantage of ridiculous policies and measures that he himself helped implement to attack the Labour government. Um, the problem that Labour has, of course, is that they've bought into all of this, um, and therefore can't really say that it's something they don't agree with or something that they're going to radically overhaul in a way which is actually more pragmatic. The Labour government has spent so much time chasing reform and its policies that it has no uh, wherewithal to say, actually, we need to just allow refugees to contribute. We need to just allow them to get out of these out of these hotels, um, and do something useful, contribute. Like the maddest thing about this in many ways, is that the great complaint is a lack of integration, right? But how do you expect people to integrate when you stick them in a hotel with nobody except each other for 3 years at a time, um, uh, being asked to stop wheeling mouses unless your mouse is muted, apparently, whoever's doing that. And yeah, and then expect and basically place people in a position where, like with prisons, prisons are, as we know, universities of crime, because you send people away for however many years and they're spending time doing nothing but feeling more and more resentful against the broader, against the society that sent them there, isolated with a bunch of people who think similarly and have the skills to teach them to be better criminals. Um, in the same way, you have people who are put into these places where they're treated like crap for lengthy periods of time, and then and given no opportunity to integrate or interact in constructive ways with with society around them. And then at the end of that, you punt them out, and everybody's like, "Oh well, they need to be integrating. Why haven't we been integrating them? Why aren't they wanting to integrate?" And it's like, well, we make it as difficult as possible for that to happen.
Yeah, and vitally, of course, they mustn't talk to our women, which is the other turning sexism into an argument for racism, which is utterly, yeah, bizarre, but is having a lot of resonance.
We actually have a
Yeah,
comment from, oh, sorry, from, I would assume, a non-anarchist who has come across us. Hello, Viola Later, great name, who is asking, is this serious? How about not coming to illegally to a country in the first place? Um, to which the response is essentially, there are no legal routes for these people to come to the UK. You can look this up. Amnesty International has talked about this extensively, in particular. Oxfam has gone into it. But um, for people who have escaped regimes such as Pakistan, for example, who are sans papier, like people who, let's say someone's escaped from Turkey. Um, the Erdogan regime has a long and inglorious history of persecuting political dissidents. Um, this would include people who are atheists or feminists or gay, um, and then chasing them around the world. And then if people are brought back, essentially throwing them in prison, throwing away the key, torturing them. These are all known things that government does. People who escape Turkey aren't doing so. Those kinds of people who escape Turkey are not doing so on a visa. They're not doing so on a work program. They cannot do so in a legal fashion. Um, if they are coming to Britain, there is no legal method for them to do that. And you can argue, of course, that they should be escaping to the next door neighbour. They should be headed for Greece, for example. But for a lot of these people, they don't speak Greek. They speak English, and they don't have family in Greece. They have family in Britain. Um, it is entirely reasonable for them to go to not a place which is already, bearing in mind, border countries take factors of 10 or 20 or 30 or 100 more than we do in just flat numbers, let alone per capita. Um, but these are people who their best chance of making a life for themselves is to come to Britain. It is the most reasonable place for them to go as a refugee. It is unreasonable to expect them to just be stranded, or it's unreasonable to expect Greece to take people we are better able to take when Greece already takes far more people than we do. That's one example. There are many, many similar. Um, and this is not to say that everybody who comes to Britain who is a refugee is a saint or an angel, but it is certainly the case that it is both our responsibility and should be, in theory, our privilege to treat people who are in that kind of need with dignity and respect, and not be calling them, shouting, "You're illegal, we should be sending you back." That's not civilized behavior, is it? So we should move on from that.
To take
There
things
is
back to,
also a
oh, sorry, Andy.
sorry.
You go, Andy.
There's a historical element as well that Britain has been responsible for a lot of migration to other places around the world where we were not invited, where it was not legal for Britain to go to India or Australia or North America. And some of the migration that Britain facilitated, from example, Africa to North America, was not done under very nice conditions. So it's possibly time that people looked at Britain's record and say that it's time for us to start putting things right in treatment of people in around the world, rather than bemoaning our situation, because a lot of the wealth and development of this country was built upon the exploitation of people around the world from what we might consider third world countries, but were basically victims of British imperialism.
Whoever this has gone into, how about Idi Amin? My goodness. Anyway, we're gonna put that one aside for a minute. I think if you're onto Idi Amin, then they're probably done on logical conversation. So moving on from that, so the other bit which I think is probably worth noting is that uh, with the vandalizing of various bits and bobs and this sort of ridiculous attention-seeking behaviour that the far right's been engaging in. It's notable, sort of circling back a little bit to what we were talking about in terms of the normalization of of sort of far right, radical right positions. It's been notable that Tory MP Andrew Griffiths is now saying that he will be handing flags out, which is essentially, along with various councillors as well, saying that they will be recommending that we don't that St George flags won't be washed off roundabouts. Is that essentially this is both primarily Tory, but Reform as well. Politicians saying it is fine to break the law, which is an astonishing thing for these people to be doing, right? Like, as anarchists, it's we are it is really not controversial or like attacking our values to say, yeah, absolutely, if you have a strong political opinion, you should take direct action to push that political opinion. And sometimes that involves putting up a poster or two, or putting up an LGBT flag or whatever, right? Like, that's well within our purview. But Tories in particular are supposed to be law of the land, hang 'em and flog 'em. Like, if you don't like the laws, you should change the laws, kind of merchant. And this seems to be completely out of the window for some reason. I mean, obviously, I don't want to start talking about two-tier justice, which is something which they've been very angry about the last year or so. But it kind of feels that way, doesn't it?
I mean, it's exactly that, and it's I. It just feels too obvious to point out, almost like the fact that they are protesting what they see as illegal behavior by doing illegal things, and just the hypocrisy there just feels sort of too just it's too obvious, and it's so silly, and it's I think most people can see this. I said earlier that it's just a couple, I doubt it's more than 100 people up and down the country who are doing this, and I think most people can sort of see how silly it is and how unserious it is as a thing. It's oh, dear me, dear me. Yeah, no, it just strikes as being so unserious, and yeah, as
But
you
yeah, we
say,
are in a situation where a protester has got 2 years in jail for putting soup on a painting. This is criminal damage, just the same. If it costs anything to have something removed, that makes it criminal damage. It's not their property. They don't have permission from the council. There is no reason why that can't be seen in exactly the same way as throwing soup on some plexiglass, which is effectively all that happened, and someone had to wash it off with a cloth, which is much harder to do if it's painted on a road or a flagpole that someone has to climb up to get it down at great public expense.
So I think the obvious thing here is with sort of is that, I mean, this is very, this is clearly a trap, and no one's sort of really looking to sort of walk into it. Like, this is kind of quite a kind of carefully considered thing, and and it is sort of very deliberate. And honestly, sort of to some extent, it is somewhat impressive that the Labour Party hasn't just sort of blindly walked into it and all that, given their sort of how they've so far sort of shown that they actually quite like to walk into far right traps and completely play into their hands. But this does seem kind of like quite a fairly obvious one. These are people who are specifically looking to sort of, they're looking, well, I mean, it's they're trying to create sound bites. They want to hear left-wing commentators say, this is this is a racist flag for racist people, and that's what they're looking for. They want that. They want people to be saying that so they can kind of clip it and sort of be like, see, these lefties are out of touch and sort of believe that kind of supporting, sort of being, sort of supporting your country is, sort of racist, and all of the kind of academic arguments around all that aside, ultimately, no one on the left is actually really sort of saying that. Like, that's, very, and it's they're building up these situations, where it's a lose-lose sort of situation, and just waiting for anyone to sort of stumble into it, and it's all just for kind of the clicks. And I think there is a sinister element to it. I mean, it's more than just clicks as well. I mean, I think like the fact that it is being, this sort of petty crime, let's call it, is being ignored, is more than just sort of the usual sort of two-tip policing that, like I said, does exist, just not in the way they think it does. But they're essentially sort of kind of like basically doing quite a good job of holding the government hostage, really, if you think about it, because the threat is that if you try and take down these flags, riots will erupt. And we're not calling for riots. We're just saying that if they kind of, sort of, if you take these down, or sort of try to sort of stop us from sort of, waving the flag, then the people will rise up, and, there will be, well, public order is, what the government is, is what the government's sort of afraid of. So I think, that's basically, as far as I can tell, is what's kind of going on there is they're setting the trap. The government doesn't seem to really be sort of walking into it, but the fact their lack of action is probably dictated as that they are sort of scared of the kind of the public order threat. It doesn't take, I think if there's one thing that everyone sort of who is kind of politically active and has a knowledge of history, is that it doesn't really take a lot of people to go out and do something. I mean, this is the whole point about encouraging direct action. A few people doing direct action can get a lot of stuff done, whether that be, spraying paint on a bank that supports genocide, or whether it's, unfortunately, sort of turning up and throwing bricks through hotel windows. Like, sort of people do listen to that sort of thing, and it, and that's an issue. Sorry, I hope that made sense.
Yeah.
A bit rambly at the end there.
What is the sentencing for encouraging a crime under the circumstances, and is that interesting?
You can encourage and assist any offence. It's what used to be called incitement, got changed in 2007. And the maximum penalty is the same as whichever crime you happen to encourage or incite, with the exception that for murder, there's not an automatic life sentence, so it can be less. There are other things. You can conspire to commit any crime. You can also aid, abet, counsel, or procure crimes under the Assisters and Abettors Act of 1861. should anyone be thinking of doing any of those things, which I strongly recommend because it'd be against the law.
Yes, absolutely. Never break the law, kids. All right. So moving on. Um, the So the result of this coverage, we've got the next story is the UK hitting its lowest birth rate ever, with fertility rate falling to 1.41 in England and Wales in 2024, while the Scottish rate was 1.25, which is, in demographic terms, fairly catastrophic over the long haul. Certainly not replacement level. One of the things that should probably be noted is that the 1.41 that England is currently enjoying is almost certainly due to a higher fertility rate amongst recent immigrants. Worth bearing in mind. Which I'm sure will only anger the far right more. Essentially, so this obviously dovetails a lot with what we've been talking about in terms of kind of the fury over migration and the difficulty with refugees not being able to work. But obviously, we have a demographic crisis. We've kind of, I think Andy hinted at this when talking about sort of our economic woes, which is already in play. We've been talking for the last 20 years about an oncoming demographic time bomb, but actually it's here, right? Like the older generation, my parents, essentially, are now retired, very much retired, in many cases, retired and getting to the point of serious ill health. And we do not have a high enough population of working age people to maintain both a functioning economy and to keep pensioners in the style to which they should be accustomed. And an ongoing fertility crisis means that this is essentially an ongoing, for as long as we're going to be alive, there is going to be an ongoing demographic problem of there being not enough young people to take care of the old people.
So just sort of addressing the sort of terms of, like, a supposed fertility crisis. I think it's kind of important to sort of stress that, like, sort of, these kind of crises around sort of fertility and all that are kind of only really an issue, or, it's an issue that comes from, sort of capitalism and the capitalist mindset, to put it sort of simply. The kind of the sort of solution, to all this is kind of, I'm afraid, going to be very boring from me. My sort of solution to everything, which is basically we just need to sort of collectivize all forms of care, like, as a community, like, we should be, stop, sort of the individualist sort of ways of thinking and sort of going off and sort of doing that. Everyone should kind of club together and sort of just start looking after people. Admittedly, easier said than done, but this, I think this is something that does kind of come up quite a bit, and leftists sort of do talk about, the problems of fertility rates and in sort of in economic terms and stuff. But I do feel it is kind of important as anarchists to kind of be careful not to kind of fall too far down that line of thinking. The sort of the problems are that, sort of are caused by slow population growth, are only problems because capitalism is driving people away and driving people to look out for themselves and put themselves before, each other. If we start addressing that and actually sort of fighting the issues, the sort of slow population growth shouldn't be an issue because, everyone's already looking after each other. I hope that's not too hippy dippy, but I think you're right. I think the far right are going to latch onto this and make a big deal out of this and get very upset and angry about it. And Labour Party are going to probably jump on the bandwagon and start suggesting that, tax cuts for families of 10 or more or whatever nonsense is historically applied to sort of such things. But, ultimately, this is just a sign that we need to do more to look out for each other.
Let's upset them a little bit more. On a global perspective, reproduction is been decline, been in decline for a while. The birth rate globally is around 2.2, which is pretty much at replacement, given the amount of extra wars and surprise deaths that's in the mix. The global births has been steady at around 140 million for the last 20 years, up and down a bit. That, if people live to a reasonable ripe old age in their early 80s, will give you a stable global population around 10 billion. Whether that's enough for the Earth to be able to sustain in the long run, that's a difficult question. But at the moment, all that we've actually got globally a situation where population has plateaued. So all the fears that people had in the 70s and 80s of the population expanding until there was no room for anyone to move, like that Star Trek episode, are pretty much out the window. And what we've got regionally is a blip, that those countries that developed first in the Industrial Revolution, where the population expanded exponentially, like Britain and Western Europe, and now have very crowded countries indeed for their population size, are the first ones to really go into population decline. Similar in some other countries that have rapidly industrialized as well. Japan, South Korea are very good examples where the birth rate has now gone down. And logically, the good part of the plan is that will then reduce their populations proportionally to what the areas fit. And if there are inconsistencies that can't be solved by moving a lot of people who are working in totally ridiculous and unnecessary jobs into productive ones, i.e. cutting out the amount of accountants, bureaucrats and other ne'er-do-wells, then those short-term problems can be solved by migration, so that people can travel around the world, which is should be borderless and free for all, widening their experiences and bringing cultural exchange to everyone. How's that, Mr. Farage?
Always one of those things where I find it like you've got the anarchist response, which is generally out of step with the rest of the left, and when it is like, not, sort of, you got these left wing, sort of talking heads who are just sort of like, no one's calling for open borders, and there's us in the corner, just like, we are.
I always feel that the left misses a trick with us because they get genuinely very angry about the anarchists existing, and I'm just sort of sat here going like, if you want to be seen as centrists, and if you want to like be the reasonable ones, you really do need us to your more radical edge. Like, if we aren't there as your furthest right, furthest left, then how can you be moderate? But, I guess preaching to the choir with that one. Okay, which leads us to, as we're getting on a bit, to our final item, which is slightly offbeat, which is the UK's conciliation body, ACAS, known for industrial disputes of all kind and the ways in which, as workers, we sometimes have to go to tribunal for things that have happened to us due to bad bosses, is looking to AI to help settle workplace disputes. And this is kind of in line with an awful lot of the legal profession, in which it's been discovered that one of the things that AI is quite good at is going through lengthy tranches of legalese and working out what you are and aren't allowed to do. It is framing this as a quote from the FT, our favourite paper, is that chatbots could be called in to help settle disputes, as the UK's state-funded conciliation body seeks to meet rising demand for its services within a tight budget. And the chief executive says that it will be part of the strategy to cope with an expected surge in calls as ministers make sweeping reforms to employment law. Some of these reforms are, in general, mildly plus, I suppose. They're at least stripping back some of the laws which the Tories introduced, enabling, more casual labour and all this kind of stuff. But his vision, there's a quote, is, "Wouldn't it be lovely if the two parties in dispute could submit their claims against each other in writing and the machine made the decision?" Now, some of our more cynical viewers will have already thought of a half dozen different ways in which this could be terribly, terribly bad news, not least being that ACAS is not well regarded across the trade union movement for its brilliance in solving industrial disputes as it is, and the idea that we just submit our cases as poorly financed. I mean, most trade unions are having to do this on the fly with lay people versus actual lawyers a lot of the time. And the tendency would seem to be that this would lopside an already lopsided system even further. But yeah, I don't know. So Andy, from your perspective of working with legal situations, not necessarily the employment tribunal system as much as the protest one, but in your experience, would this kind of thing be a general boon, or would it be potentially misused in all kinds of interesting ways?
Well, there's lots of examples in science fiction of justice machines and so computers making those decisions. The problem with any computerized system is that rubbish in, rubbish out. It's how it's programmed. It's how it's set up and what laws it's looking at. On the simple issue of if you were facing some sort of criminal charge, would you prefer to have a machine that just looked at the facts, or some set of human beings with their own prejudices? Then you look at how our system works. Now, if I had the option of a district judge or a machine, I'd be very tempted to consider the machine that has not spent 40 years of its life hobnobbing with rich people and generally accepting their values. If I was facing jury and it was in Southwark, I would prefer the human beings. If I was facing a jury and I was out in Chelmsford, I'd take the machine because it is one of those things that the machine is just going to churn out what's put into it. And we all know with the law that the way that it is written is so that it appears to be fair, but the way that it can be interpreted is always subtly adjusted towards the ruling class by them running it. And so there is, I'm not saying that it's a good thing in its entirety, but I don't think you'd be actually getting a lot worse results than we do at the moment, and you might not be getting so many random ones. Another thing where you look at is it will save a huge amount of money because judges, you can look up the pay scale for judges, but just as a minor aside, just standard judge's wig in this country costs £5,000. And so unless we put those on the machine, there'd be a few bob. And of course, as we were talking about in an anarchist, more rational society, then human beings can do the jobs that human beings can actually do best, whether that is caring for people in their community or filling in potholes. Whereas a lot of the so-called intellectual jobs at the moment probably can be replaced by AI, and those are the ones that we're actually paying for more through the nose for than for people doing the useful stuff. So I'm not actually that negative on it.
Fair enough. Okay, on which note we have gotten to roughly the hour, so I think we've probably timed this one about right. I actually quite enjoyed doing a main topic as opposed to kind of bouncing between several this time around, so maybe we'll do that again. But thank you very much, Sam, and thank you very much, Andy, for your contributions. Interesting as
Thank you.
always. And thank you to our viewers, and apologies to No Don't, who I accidentally put into timeout and deleted their messages. That was entirely on me, and I do apologise. Right, on which note, lovely to see you all, and